Marcus thought the darkness would keep his secret. He stood over Vicki Walker on that godforsaken stretch of dirt road, watching her claw backward through the freezing mud until her spine cracked against the rusted bumper of his battered red sedan. The trunk yawned open behind her like a coffin waiting to be filled. Her gray hoodie was torn at the shoulder, caked in filth, and her combat boots scraped uselessly against the wet earth as she tried to push herself farther from him. But there was nowhere left to go. Marcus rolled his thick neck and flexed his mud-splattered fists, his dark t-shirt stretched tight across his massive frame, every inch of him a weapon built for intimidation. He was convinced the night belonged to him. He was convinced that this forgotten, pitch-black back road, miles from the nearest streetlight, was the one place no one would ever find them. That Vicki's muffled screams would dissolve into the cold air and be forgotten by morning. That her savings, her passwords, her entire financial lifeline would be his, by sunrise enough to buy himself one more week of breathing from the men he owed. But Marcus made one catastrophic miscalculation. He never once looked over his right shoulder. Because exactly 20 feet behind him, standing at the edge of where the sedan's red taillights bled into nothing, was a man who had no business being on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. Ryu Dong-Yul didn't flinch. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood there, immaculate, terrifying, and patient, his pristine dark blue tailored suit untouched by a single fleck of mud, his hair styled to surgical precision, one hand resting calmly at his side, while the other held a glowing smartphone that pulsed like a heartbeat in the dark. The screen displayed a single blinking dot. Vicki's location. The dot Marcus had been too stupid and too desperate to ever think to look for. Ryu hadn't stumbled onto this road by accident. He hadn't come because he cared about Marcus's groveling excuses or his empty promises to repay his crushing gambling debts. No. The Korean Mafia boss had been tracking a signal buried in Vicki's belongings for weeks. A military-grade chip slipped quietly into the lining of her bag because he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who had studied human desperation his entire life, that Marcus would eventually come for her. And when Marcus did, he would deliver himself directly into the hands of the one man he had been running from. Marcus thought he was the most dangerous thing on that road tonight. He thought dragging a terrified woman through the mud made him powerful. But he was nothing more than a debtor on borrowed time, standing in the open, completely unaware that the apex predator had already closed the distance, and the debt Ryu had come to collect could not be paid in cash. Now, this is where the story truly ignites, because what Ryu does next doesn't just destroy Marcus. It changes Vicki Walker's life in a way she never could have imagined. The woman sitting in that mud, shaking, terrified, convinced she was about to die in the trunk of her ex-boyfriend's car. She's about to discover that someone has been watching her resilience, her brilliance, and her survival from the shadows, and he didn't come to bury her. He came to recruit her. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Now, let's dive in. 1 hour earlier, Vicki Walker was dreaming about silence. It was the first dream she'd had in months that wasn't a nightmare, just the soft, velvet weight of nothing. No shouting, no shattering glass, no hands around her throat, just the hum of her bedroom fan and the faint amber glow of a streetlight leaking through the curtains of her third-floor apartment. She had changed the locks twice, filed the restraining order, moved across town to a building with a deadbolt and a buzzer system that was supposed to mean something. She had done everything right. And for 3 fragile weeks, it had worked. She had started sleeping through the night again. She had started believing she might actually be free. The front door came off its hinges at 1:47 a.m. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't a rattle. It was a single, concussive impact, like a car crash happening inside her living room. And then the door folded inward, and Marcus filled the frame, all 6'3" of him, his shoulders heaving. His dark t-shirt damp with sweat, his jeans already streaked with grime like he'd been crawling through ditches before he got here. His eyes were wrong. That was the first thing Vicki registered as she jolted upright in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought it would crack through her chest. His eyes weren't angry. They were empty. The flat, disconnected stare of a man who had already made a decision that couldn't be unmade. She screamed. She screamed loud enough to split her own throat, and her hand flew to the nightstand where her phone should have been, but Marcus was already across the room. 3 massive strides. He grabbed a fistful of her hoodie and yanked her off the mattress like she weighed nothing. The phone clattered to the floor. Her knees hit the hardwood, and she tried to twist free, tried to claw at his wrist, but his grip was iron, and his body was a wall, and he was already dragging her toward the shattered doorway. She kicked. She clawed. She screamed his name like it might still mean something to him, like some fragment of the man she'd once trusted might surface behind those dead eyes. It didn't. He hauled her down the stairwell by her arm, her combat boots catching on every step, her free hand raking the railing hard enough to tear the skin from her fingers. As he wrenched her through the lobby, her shoulder caught the strap of her handbag hanging on the hallway hook, the same bag she carried everywhere, the one with her wallet and her keys, and, buried deep in the lining where she'd never think to look, a chip smaller than a grain of rice that had been transmitting her location for 3 weeks. The bag tangled around her arm as Marcus dragged her forward, and he didn't bother to rip it free. He didn't care about a bag. He cared about passwords. The building was silent. No doors opened. No voices called out. The world just watched and said nothing. The night air hit her face like a slap cold, sharp, tasting like exhaust and wet pavement. Marcus's red sedan sat at the curb, engine running, driver's door hanging open. The car was a wreck, dented quarter panels, a spiderweb crack across the windshield, mud caked into the wheel wells like it had already been driven through hell tonight. He wrenched the passenger door open and threw her inside. Her head cracked against the center console. Before she could right herself, before she could lunge for the handle, he was behind the wheel, and the locks engaged with a sound like a gun being cocked. The tires shrieked. The car lurched forward. And Vicki's apartment, her sanctuary, her proof that she could start over, shrank in the side mirror until the darkness swallowed it whole. For the first 2 miles, Marcus said nothing. His hands strangled the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his knuckles pale beneath the grime. His jaw was clenched so tight, the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Vicki pressed herself against the passenger door, as far from him as the small cabin would allow, her fingers trembling around the door handle she already knew was child-locked. She could hear his breathing ragged, uneven, the desperate rhythm of a man who had been running for days. The speedometer climbed past 70. The city lights began to thin. Storefronts gave way to warehouses. Warehouses gave way to nothing. Then Marcus broke. It started as a mutter low, guttural, half swallowed by the engine noise. Then it became words. Then it became screaming. He slammed his palm against the dashboard, hard enough to crack the plastic housing around the air vent, and the confession poured out of him like something diseased. You don't understand what they'll do to me, Vicki. You don't understand. He owed money. That much she had known or suspected back when they were together. The late-night phone calls he'd taken the other room, the unexplained cash, the bruises he'd come home with that he'd blame on pickup basketball games. But the scope of what Marcus was screaming at her now was something she had never imagined. He owed the Korean Mafia, not thousands, hundreds of thousands. Gambling debts that had metastasized across 3 underground card rooms, debts that had been bought and consolidated by a single organization, debts that now sat under the authority of a man Marcus referred to only as the Korean. He never said the name. He didn't have to. The way his voice cracked when he referenced him. The way his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror like he expected, a black SUV to materialize out of the dark. Vicki understood that whoever this man was, Marcus was more afraid of him than he had ever been of anything in his life. Your savings, Marcus snarled, swerving across the center line and correcting with a violent jerk. Your little emergency fund, your retirement, all of it. You're giving me every cent tonight, or I swear to God, Vicki. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the car like smoke thick, suffocating, filling every gap until there was no room left to breathe. Vicki pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and watched the last fragments of civilization disappear. There were no more streetlights, no more road signs. Just the twin beams of the sedan's headlights cutting through absolute darkness, illuminating nothing but cracked asphalt and overgrown brush on either side. He was taking her somewhere no one would hear her, somewhere no one would come looking. What neither of them knew, what Marcus, in all his frantic, sweat-drenched desperation, could never have conceived, was that 12 miles behind them, gliding through the same darkness with the silence of a blade through water, a matte black luxury sedan was following their exact trajectory, not speeding, not swerving, just flowing through the night like it had all the time in the world. Inside, the cabin smelled of leather and sandalwood. The only sound was the near-silent purr of the engine and the faintest electronic chime from a smartphone resting in a manicured hand. Ryu Dong-Yul sat in the back seat with the stillness of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush. His dark blue suit was pressed to a knife's edge, the subtly patterned undershirt buttoned precisely to the second collar point. His hair was immaculate, swept back with the kind of deliberate perfection that communicated control over every molecule of his existence. He held the phone at chest level, tilted slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the screen with the patient, unblinking focus of a surgeon monitoring a heartbeat on a flatline ward. A single green dot pulsed on the map. Vicki's location. The military-grade tracker he had planted in the lining of her handbag 3 weeks ago was performing flawlessly accurate to within 6 inches, updating every 4 seconds, painting a perfect breadcrumb trail of Marcus's erratic, panicked route out of the city. Ryu already knew where Marcus was going. He'd studied the man's patterns for months, the routes he drove when he was paranoid, the back roads he defaulted to when he thought he was being clever. Marcus had ditched his own phone 48 hours ago, convinced that going dark would make him invisible, a reasonable assumption for a reasonable threat. But Marcus was not dealing with a reasonable man. Ryu had anticipated this move before Marcus had even made it. The tracker on Vicki wasn't a backup plan. It was the plan. Because Ryu understood something about Marcus that Marcus would never understand about himself. Desperate men don't innovate. They revert. They go back to the one person they think they can still control. And for Marcus, that person had always been Vicki. Ryu's driver, a broad, expressionless man in a black turtleneck, glanced at the rearview mirror for instructions. Ryu didn't look up from the phone. He simply raised 2 fingers from the armrest. Slow down. Give him room. Let the rat believe he's found his hole. The green dot on the screen turned off the paved road and onto a dirt path. Ryu's jaw tightened by exactly 1 millimeter, the only evidence of any emotion at all. He tapped the screen once, expanding the satellite view. The path led nowhere. No structures. No intersections. Just a half-mile stretch of rutted mud, ending in dead brush and darkness. Marcus had found his killing ground. He just didn't know he'd chosen his own. The sedan fishtailed onto the dirt path, and Marcus killed the headlights, plunging everything into a suffocating blackness, broken only by the dull red glow of the taillights. He threw the car into park and was out of the driver's seat before the engine had fully settled, rounding the hood with the jerky, overstimulated energy of a man running on adrenaline and nothing else. He ripped the passenger door open and grabbed Vicki by the front of her hoodie, dragging her out of the car and into the mud. Her knees buckled. Her palms hit the wet earth. The cold was immediate and total, soaking through her jeans, numbing her fingers, turning her breath into thin, trembling clouds that dissolved into nothing. Passwords, Marcus barked, standing over her. His silhouette was enormous against the faint red light, a featureless black mass radiating violence. Every account, every pin. You give them to me right now. Vicki looked up at him, mud on her face, dirt in her hair, her gray hoodie torn, her pinkish top stained dark with filth. Her entire body was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the animal recognition of what this was. This was the end of the road. Literally. There was nothing behind her but dead brush, and nothing ahead of her but Marcus, and the open mouth of a rusted trunk. But something in her refused. Maybe it was the 3 weeks of silence she'd fought so hard to build. Maybe it was the new locks, and the restraining order, and the quiet mornings where she'd sat at her kitchen table and convinced herself she was more than what he had made her. Maybe it was just the simple, desperate understanding that if she gave him what he wanted, she would never leave this road alive anyway. Whatever it was, it climbed up through her chest and lodged itself in her throat, and when she opened her mouth, the word that came out was small, but absolute. No. Marcus stared at her. For one full second, the world was perfectly still. The mud, the dark, the faint tick of the sedan's cooling engine. Then his face twisted into something she had never seen before, not anger, not frustration, but the unhinged, cornered fury of a man who had just realized his last option was slipping through his fingers. He turned to the trunk, popped it with a single violent slap of his palm against the release latch. The lid swung up, and the trunk light flickered on weak, yellowed, barely strong enough to illuminate the stained carpet lining and the frayed bungee cords, coiled inside like sleeping snakes. You want to say no? His voice was barely human now. Low, vibrating, the voice of a man who had stepped past his own threshold and couldn't find his way back. Then you can say it from inside the trunk. He grabbed her arm, not her hoodie this time, her actual arm, his fingers digging into the muscle hard enough to leave bruises she would carry for weeks, and he hauled her off the ground. She fought. She twisted. She drove the heel of her combat boot into his shin and heard him grunt, but he didn't let go. He just tightened his grip and shoved her backward until her lower back slammed against the lip of the trunk and her feet left the ground, and she was half in, half out. Staring up at the black sky through tear-blurred eyes, feeling the cold metal rim bite into her spine. And then he pushed. Vicki hit the floor of the trunk on her side, her elbow cracking against something hard, a tire, iron, maybe a jack, and the pain shot white-hot up to her shoulder. She scrambled, trying to right herself, trying to claw her way out before the lid came down. But Marcus's hand was on her chest, pressing her flat, and his other hand was reaching for the trunk lid, and his breathing was loud and fast and finished. And that was when the dirt road behind him lit up with a single, cold, blue-white glow. Marcus saw the light before he understood it. It wasn't the headlights of a passing car. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a single, cold, synthetic glow. The unmistakable blue-white pulse of a smartphone screen hovering in the darkness behind him like a disembodied eye. It appeared without warning, without sound, without any of the signals a human being is supposed to give when they approach another human being in the dead of night. No footsteps. No engine noise. No crunch of gravel. Just the light, floating at chest height, perfectly still, as if it had always been there, and the darkness had simply decided to stop hiding it. Marcus's hand froze on the trunk lid. His fingers were still wrapped around the edge, still ready to slam it shut on Vicki's broken body. But his arm had locked mid-motion, like the electrical signal between his brain and his muscles had been severed. The sweat on his neck went ice-cold. His jaw slackened. And the sound that came out of his mouth wasn't a word. It was the low, involuntary exhale of a man whose body had recognized a predator before his mind could catch up. He turned around. Ryu Dong-Yul stood 20 feet away, centered perfectly between the twin red taillights like the darkness itself had staged his entrance. He hadn't walked into the scene. He had materialized. His dark blue suit was flawless, not a crease, not a wrinkle. Not a single fleck of mud on the polished leather of his shoes, despite the fact that he was standing on the same godforsaken dirt road that had turned Marcus into a filthy, sweating ruin. His hair was immaculate, swept back with a precision that bordered on architectural. The subtly patterned undershirt beneath his jacket was buttoned to the collar, clean and sharp, as though he had stepped out of a corner office rather than the belly of the night. One hand hung, relaxed at his side. The other held the glowing phone at a slight angle, its screen still displaying the green dot, Vicki's dot pulsing calmly at the exact coordinates where they all now stood. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Marcus with an expression that contained no anger, no urgency, no theatrics of any kind. It was the face of a man examining an insect on his windshield. Mild, clinical, already past the question of whether or not to wipe it away. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds, during which Marcus's entire nervous system recalibrated from predator to prey. 4 seconds, during which every lie he had told himself tonight that he was invisible, that he was clever, that ditching his phone had made him a ghost disintegrated like wet paper. 4 seconds during which Vicki, still crumpled in the open trunk with her elbow throbbing and her vision swimming, registered the shift. She felt it before she saw it. The pressure changed. Marcus's hand lifted off her chest. The suffocating weight of his dominance simply evaporated, replaced by something older and heavier and infinitely more dangerous. Then Ryu spoke. His voice was quiet, not soft quiet. There is a difference. Soft implies gentleness. Ryu's voice carried the quiet of a blade being drawn from a sheath, controlled. Exact. Every syllable placed with the deliberate economy of a man who had never once in his life needed to repeat himself. Marcus, one word. Just his name. But the way Ryu said it stripped every ounce of power from the man who owned it. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a question. It was a receipt. A confirmation that the account had been located and the balance was due. Marcus's mouth opened and closed, his massive frame. The same frame that had kicked down Vicki's door and dragged her across a parking lot and shoved her into a trunk like she was cargo. That frame shrank. His shoulders dropped. His hands came away from the car and hung at his sides, and for the first time all night, his fingers weren't curled into fists. They were open, trembling. "I was going to get you your money," Marcus said. His voice cracked on the word money like a teenage boy's. "That's what this is. I was getting your money tonight. She has savings accounts I just needed." "You needed her passwords." Ryu took one step forward. Just one. The mud didn't touch him. Vicki would later swear on everything she had left that the mud parted around his shoes like it understood who it was dealing with. You needed her retirement fund. Her emergency savings. The $47,000 she built from nothing after you drained her the first time. Marcus blinked. The number hit him like a physical blow. Not because it was wrong, because it was exact. Ryu knew the amount. Ryu knew what Vicki had saved. Ryu had been watching long before tonight. That money wouldn't have covered the interest on your debt, Marcus. Not even close. Ryu's eyes didn't waver. They stayed fixed on Marcus with the unbroken focus of a rifle scope. You owe my organization $642,000. You have owed it for 11 months. You were given 3 extensions. You were given a payment structure that a child could have followed. And instead of following it, you gambled the first installment. You borrowed against the second, and you ran from the third. He paused. The phone in his hand dimmed as the screen timed out, but Ryu didn't glance at it. He didn't need it anymore. He'd arrived. Your debt cannot be paid with her money, Marcus. It could never be paid with her money. Marcus took a step backward. His heel caught the bumper and he stumbled, barely catching himself against the trunk. Vicki flinched at the impact, pressing herself deeper into the corner. Then what? Marcus's voice was barely a whisper now. The aggression had been siphoned out of him completely, replaced by the hollow, rattling terror of a man who had just realized the walls of his maze were closing in. Then what do you want from me? Ryu tilted his head. It was a small movement, no more than 2 degrees, but it carried the weight of a verdict being read. Your debt can only be paid one way. He didn't say the word. He didn't need to. It landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, and Marcus understood it. In his bones, in the marrow, in the part of himself that had known this was coming, since the first time he sat down at a card table with money he didn't have. Marcus ran. It was pure reflex, the desperate, graceless lunge of a cornered animal that has run out of options and defaulted to the one primitive response left. He bolted to the left, away from the car, toward the dead brush and the darkness beyond it, his mud-caked boots churning against the earth. He made it exactly 7 steps. They came from everywhere and nowhere. 3 figures, maybe 4. They materialized from the shadows the same way Ryu had, silent, instantaneous, as if the darkness itself had grown limbs. They wore black. All of them. No logos, no insignias, no distinguishing features of any kind. They moved with the fluid, synchronized precision of men who had done this 100 times before and had stopped counting long ago. The first one intercepted Marcus at the tree line, stepping into his path with the casual ease of someone closing a door. Marcus tried to pivot, tried to change direction, and the second figure was already there behind him, low, sweeping his legs with a single, controlled strike that dropped Marcus face first into the mud. Before he could push himself up, before he could even draw breath to scream, hands pinned his wrists behind his back, and a knee pressed into his spine with exactly enough force to communicate that resistance was not an option. It was over in 4 seconds, perhaps 3. The same amount of time it takes to exhale. Marcus's face was in the mud now, the same mud he had ground Vicki's body into, the same freezing, filthy earth he had used as his stage for dominance and cruelty. He gasped against it, tasting dirt and iron, his chest heaving under the weight on his back, and the sound he made was small and animal, and nothing like the roaring, towering man who had kicked down a door an hour ago. Ryu didn't watch. He had already turned away from Marcus the moment his men moved, dismissing him from his attention as completely and permanently as one closes a file that has been resolved. His gaze shifted to the trunk, to Vicki. She was still inside, curled on her side, her arms wrapped around herself, her torn hoodie pulled tight over her shaking frame. The trunk light cast a sickly yellow glow over her face, illuminating the mud streaked across her cheekbones and the tears that had carved clean tracks through the dirt. She was staring at Ryu with an expression that held no single emotion, but all of them at once: terror, confusion, relief, suspicion layered on top of each other, like paint that hadn't dried. Ryu approached the trunk slowly, not cautiously slowly. There is a difference. Cautious implies uncertainty. Ryu moved slowly because he understood that the woman in front of him had spent the last hour being grabbed, dragged, thrown, and shoved by a man twice her size, and that the last thing she needed was another man moving fast. He stopped 2 feet from the trunk's edge. He didn't reach for her. He didn't offer his hand. Not yet. He simply stood there, looking down at her with an expression that was different from the one he had given Marcus. The cold authority was still there. It never left. It was structural, built into the architecture of his face. But beneath it, or maybe beside it, was something else. Recognition, not pity. Ryu Dong-Yul did not traffic in pity, but recognition, the acknowledgement of something valuable that had been mistreated. "You're Vicki Walker," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was locked. Ryu studied her for one more moment. Then he reached up to his own collar, unfastened the single button of his dark blue suit jacket, and slid it off his shoulders in one smooth motion. The jacket probably cost more than 3 months of Vicki's rent. It was pristine, pressed. It smelled faintly of sandalwood and something sharper beneath it. Cedar, maybe, or the cold mineral scent of authority itself. He leaned forward and draped it over Vicky's shoulders, with the careful precision of a man placing a crown. The weight of it settled around her like armor. "Can you stand?" he asked. She nodded. She wasn't sure she could, but she nodded. Ryu extended his hand open, palm up, unhurried. She looked at it for a long moment. The hand was clean. The nails were trimmed. There was no mud on it, no blood, no evidence of the violence that had just occurred 20 feet away. It was the hand of a man who never dirtied himself with the work, but always controlled the outcome. Vicki took it. He pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness, steadying her when her knees buckled against the cold stiffness in her joints. She stepped out of the trunk and onto the dirt road, Ryu's jacket hanging past her hips, her combat boots sinking into the mud. She didn't look back at Marcus. She couldn't hear him anymore. Whether that was because he had been moved or silenced, she didn't know. And in that moment, standing in the faint red glow, with Ryu's hand still holding hers, she found that she didn't care. Ryu guided her away from the sedan and toward the darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty anymore. A matte black luxury car sat 30 yards back on the path, its engine idling with a sound so low it was almost subliminal. The rear door was already open. Interior light spilled out in a warm golden rectangle. Leather seats, climate control, the faint glow of a console screen. It looked like a portal to a different world. A world without mud, without screaming, without trunks that gaped open like coffins. Vicki stopped at the door. She looked at Ryu. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was raw, shredded, barely above a whisper. Ryu met her gaze. His expression didn't change. But something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation completing, a decision locking into place. "Because you're worth more than he ever understood," he said. "And because I don't waste valuable things." Vicki held his stare for 3 full seconds. Then she lowered herself into the back seat, pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders, and let the door close behind her. 6 weeks later, Vicki Walker sat in a glass-walled office on the 43rd floor of a building with no name on its directory. The city sprawled beneath her like a circuit board, glittering, electric, alive. She wore a charcoal suit that had been tailored to her frame with the same surgical precision Ryu applied to everything in his world. Her hair was pulled back. Her posture was straight. The combat boots were gone. The mud was gone. The trembling, tear-streaked woman who had crawled through the dirt on a nameless road was gone. In front of her, 3 screens displayed a constellation of financial data, accounts, transfers, asset flows, the intricate arterial system of an empire that operated in the spaces between legal and lethal. She understood every number. She had always understood numbers. That was the part of herself Marcus had never seen, because Marcus had never looked at her and seen anything worth understanding. Ryu had. He had seen it from a distance, through transaction records and account histories and the quiet, a meticulous way she had rebuilt her finances from nothing after Marcus had destroyed them the first time. He had seen the architecture of a brilliant mind buried under the rubble of abuse. And while Marcus had tried to break her down for $47,000, Ryu had recognized that Vicki Walker, given the right infrastructure and the right protection, was worth more than Marcus would generate in 10 lifetimes. She didn't flinch anymore. Not when the phone rang at odd hours. Not when Ryu's men moved through the halls with their expressionless faces and their silent footsteps. Not when the numbers on her screens represented sums that would have made her old self dizzy. She had stepped out of the mud and into the machine, and the machine had given her the one thing she had never been able to build for herself: walls that no one, not Marcus, not anyone could ever break down again. The office door opened. Ryu stepped in, jacket buttoned, phone in hand, exactly as composed as the night she'd first seen him, standing in the taillights. He set a single folder on her desk, nodded once, and turned to leave. "Ryu," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. Not softly, not with the fragile, trembling gratitude of a woman who had been rescued. She said it the way he would have said it, measured, direct, as a statement of fact between equals. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, not quite anything. But it was the closest thing to warmth she had ever seen cross his face. He left without a word, and Vicki turned back to her screens, her fingers steady, her mind sharp, her back to the glass wall and the entire city behind her. A woman who had been dragged through the dirt and had emerged, finally and permanently, untouchable. Drop a comment. Do you think Vicki can hold her own in a world built on blood money? Or is she in deeper than she knows? Like this video, if you're obsessed with this story that keeps getting more dangerous. The next chapter drops soon. And trust me, you are not ready for the truth about what Ryu really saved her for. See you in the next one. If Vicki survives.